Hello, Melissa Crook here from the Field Podcast. I'm so thrilled this week to be here to share a second episode this week with you. And this one's a special episode. Ours are all special, but this one has a little different story behind it. No pun intended for what's coming. We are so excited and proud to be part of Podcasthon this year. And Podcasthon happens worldwide where podcasters get a chance to bring on organizations that they want the world to know about, to invite you into supporting them, because we all know that these important nonprofit organizations all need our support. And I have the great pleasure of featuring the Herstory Writers Network. They are very close to my heart. You'll get to hear about that in the episode today. And so today's podcast is the story of Herstory. And you're going to get to hear from our my good friend, Erica Duncan and Helen Dorado Alessi, who I met when I was able to work with them for a couple of years when I lived on Long Island a few years back. Erica is the founder and artistic director. Helen is the organizational management consultant and facilitator. And you're also going to get to hear about all the ways you can support them. But we wanted to give you and still give you, even within that, intentional ways to engage with this episode. So here they are. Challenge yourself to step out of your comfort zone. That might include attending a writing workshop, share your writing in an online forum, or anything that puts yourself out there as a storyteller. If writing is not your thing, you can still read other people's stories. Comment on them, make them feel seen and heard and known, and then find your own special way to share your story. But stories are such great bridge connectors, and you're going to hear the impact of Herstory's story today and the difference they're making in the world, and why it's so important to me that you know about them and are able to support them. Thanks so much for being with us today on this special episode. And we hope these ways to engage really make you think about how you're showing up in the world and how your story can be a story that builds a bridge with someone. And as importantly, listening to someone else's story as well. Take care, and thanks so much for being with us. Field podcast audience, and also friends out in the Podcasthon world this week, and that's going to make more sense in a minute. I am your host, Melissa Crook here. I am the host of the Field Podcast, and I'm very happy to participate in this third edition of Podcasthon. For 1 week, this week, in the middle of March, we are having thousands of podcasts join Podcasthon to highlight charities and nonprofits of our choices. And today I have the pleasure here on the Field Podcast of welcoming Herstory Writers Network. I am thrilled to have this opportunity. I am thrilled to have this privilege. And this nonprofit is literally changing hearts and minds through the tool of memoir writing. And you're going to understand this more as we go through Herstory's story today. I'm going to be using the talking points that I would normally use on our podcast, those of you who are regular listeners here, but I'm going to put it in the context of Herstory's story rather than an individual story. And I think this is going to be a really compelling way to share the value of her story, its journey, and really personalize it for you. I do have two wonderful people from Herstory with me here today. Founder Erica Duncan. She has been doing this for 30 years. She also serves as the executive director and creative director. And Helen Dorado Alessi, who has been here for 10 years now as the school and community program consultant. Those of you who have been with me will recognize Helen's name from season 1. She was one of my season 1 pioneers who agreed to be one of my early guests. And her episode is still mine and our blog writer Jessica Garrison's favorite episode to this day. It stands the test of time, the wisdom that she has shared. And so I'm so thrilled to have both of them with me here today to tell you a little bit about her story, I'm going to go to their main page at herstorywriters.org. And that's where you're going to find just a little bit more about what they're about in the classroom curriculum, Beyond Bars curriculum, Brave Journeys curriculum. There's a video about all of that there for you to learn more. But they really believe that writing at its best can conquer oppression. It can change heart, minds, and policy. But this doesn't happen by magic. The notion of passing along the dare to care, the cornerstone of the Her Story approach, is deceptively simple and therefore infinitely replicable. The toolkit that has grown up around it over an almost 30-year period is multi-layered, far-reaching, and profound. From a single workshop on Long Island, New York, to an international network of small writing circles, bringing forth the voices of writers of all ages and walks of life, incarcerated and free, celebrating almost 3 decades of bringing forth the voices of people whose stories have been silenced and unsung, changing hearts, minds, and policy, one story at a time. I personally came across her story when I lived on Long Island for 3 years. And I came through them from a mentor program that I was working with at Adelphi University. And we decided one semester to partner with Herstory as a way to help our mentees tell their own story. And that was the beginning for me. I was curious. I was asked by our director, Tatsani Williams-West, to check out a workshop to see what I thought. And I was hooked. It was just this beautiful room of people from all backgrounds, all ages, all socioeconomic spaces, ethnicities, faith spaces, the whole 9 yards, coming together in one room to share their stories via memoir. And I was challenged in this room. If you're in the room, you've got to write. That's part of the deal. And it's how it just creates a whole new understanding of telling your own story and getting in touch with your own story, but also listening to other stories and really seeing the human being behind so many of these policies and data that exist in the world. And I was hooked. I went back weekly. I decided 6 months later to be a facilitator through this facilitator training. And it changed everything for me in terms of how I see other people's experiences. It changed the way I vote. You all have heard me talk about this before. You all might remember Paula Chirino's from our first episode from season 4. Her story changed everything for me. And go back and listen to that episode if you want a reminder of why that is to be. But I just knew when this opportunity came up via Podcasthon in November of 2024 that this had to be the group that I featured. And I can't think of a more important time to share her story. So on that note, if you want to donate to them, go to herstorywriters.org and hit that donate button. This will be in our show notes, and I'll mention it again here at the end of the podcast. But trust me, you will be racing yourself to get there by the time you hear what these special people and this special organization do to help people know that their voice deserves to be heard, is valuable, is seen, is known. And I can't think of a more important time to talk about her story. I'm welcoming today Erica Duncan. Erica, welcome.
Well, thank you. I'm happy to be here.
I'm happy to have you. And Helen, I'm so happy to have you back, my friend, Helen Dorado Alessi. I never get to see you enough, and I'm so happy to have you here with me today. All right, we're going to start at the beginning. I want you, Helen, to describe the character traits of her story. If you were to assign character traits to her story, what would they be?
Hi, Melissa. It's so great to see you. I'm a real fan of the podcast. I am totally enamored with the way you have designed and helped people feel so welcome, women especially, to feel so welcome to know their voice and share. And of course, I'm a big fan of Paula Torino as well. She was one of our first students that I can remember who really took on such an important role in telling that beautiful several stories, because what happens is folks don't write one story. They write several because that's what their lives dictate. So traits of her story. So one of the things, I was listening to you as you spoke, and you said something like, the magic of her story. And one of the traits I feel is important to express is, while it's not magic, it is magical. And I can tell you from being in classrooms and in all different kinds of settings that what Miss Duncan Erica has done is to create a way so that people have the opportunity to write their stories in such a compelling way that it is magical. And to see the growth and development in people, the confidence, their, in Spanish, we say manera de ser, their way of being, right? Sometimes it's just about being, but isn't it important also to be a good listener? So her story, an element of her story is it invites you, it encourages you to be not only the storyteller, but the story listener. And I use the phrase storyteller in a very different way. When you're reading your story, it's already been heard and workshopped may not be the right word, but by the other folks in the room. And the reason we say that is because you, as the listener, what we call the stranger reader, is listening to the story for the first time and coming up with all kinds of questions and curiosities. And because you're learning for the very first time, maybe about the background of an ethnic group, the inner workings of a particular place or people. And the other element, I would say, is respect and dignity, that the importance of holding every single person's story for the facilitators and for Erica is about, a privilege, an honor to hear somebody's most inner, deepest desires of what they want to be heard. So it's not about deep, dark secrets, but it is about sharing a moment of your life that will help the stranger reader or the listener understand in a much deeper way. Just as you said, Melissa, it changed you, didn't it?
Mm-hmm.
It changed who you are. And this is what I feel is why I've, followed Erica for 10 years like a little puppy dog, because even after 10 years, I'm learning.
Yeah. Yeah. And that's such a critical point there. It really helped me navigate. It began a healing journey for me in many ways, but it also taught me curiosity instead of judgment. And curiosity about people's backgrounds, curiosity about how they got to the point that they were. And that, I think, is such an important piece of the human experience and understanding someone's story, that curiosity, that realization that my story is not someone else's story and someone else's story isn't mine. And just because my experience is X doesn't mean that your experience is X. And they're all true. I think we live in such a black and white narrative. This is true. This is not true. There are all of our stories are true in the way we've lived them and experienced them. And that looks different. So being able to see the nuance And when you can see the nuance, then that opens your mind to the curiosity and the possibility, because you're considering that nuance. You're not just considering data, numbers, statistics. It becomes personal, and that listening piece. And I think I would add too, the storyteller piece, the listener also has a chance to become the storyteller, because I have told countless people the stories of people that I have heard in that room. Not always using their, but I've shared, like, if someone's talking about somebody, disability policies and whatnot, I'm like, well, yeah, but I heard this story when I was involved with Herstory, and this mom had this experience with her daughter, and it involved X, Y, and Z. Where's the consideration for that? I mean, so I think that's another important piece too, is the storyteller becomes all the people that have heard the story.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I love that. Erica, do you have anything you want to add to the character traits piece?
I was thinking, and this might be an interesting way to start. I think that Herstory shares the safe space of all these more confidential, like the anonymous groups. It shares something with the kind of consciousness raising that was done, back when I was coming of age. But the difference there is that because, as Helen said, people are really being empowered to select what parts of their stories they want the world to hear. And they're being carefully taught techniques so that memoir to us is not about true confessions. It's not about outing your deep, dark secrets. It's about what part of your story could help another human being, what part of your story might help the world, like really find a new path. And therefore, we've had people who said, well, shouldn't we all sign a confidentiality thing when we start? And we very often say, of course, we're not going to share parts of people's stories where they say, no, please don't. But we're really, whether we're working with second graders or men who are in life sentences without any opportunity of parole, whoever we're working with, it's like, really, what parts of your story do you want to be told and retold over and over again in this beautiful interconnected ripple effect? And the fact that you're so moved by the stories, that's what begins to change hearts and minds. I have a wonderful judge who we're working with as an ally, this Judge Camacho, and it's like he always talks about the light inside each person and how this is really the quest not to uncover trauma, pain. Of course, you're uncovering what has hurt us all, but you're also rekindling that light so that he works on that project. We're working with court-involved young people, and it's and also law interns. So when they start, they're thinking, what part of my story might change a law or might change a condition of poverty or gang violence that led me into something? What are the things so that and what that does, and we were just talking about this morning, it erases the difference between allies and people who were deeply affected. Too many times you say, well, we don't really have a right because we weren't affected. We weren't in prison, or we weren't in this domestic violence or something. But if we all come together, because we know that our stories are only a tiny part of understanding the world together, then it's not surprising that you get in a workshop. We've had foundation heads who are writing side by side with people who've just gotten out of prison or mental institutions. And we've had people who've been privileged to have very fancy educations, and other people who are usually our strongest writers who learn storytelling, either around the kitchen table or listening to people in the street. So I think that the idea that the stories are going to be spread, and that the stories, they're healing, but they're not healing just the me of it. They're like, each story is meant to sort of heal somebody else. And it's something, words that you get thrown around like narrative responsibility. But what does that actually mean? And if you just go to someone who's been hurt and you say, admit it, you've done wrong, it's very different from that person sharing the journey. And one of my favorite things that's going on right now, as we were approached by these men who are serving life sentences in Solano, a prison in California, without any hope for parole. And we started this workshop with someone who's using our curriculum. And behind bars and working with me by Global Telling once a week. But he was so drawn to the fact that our whole method is about empathy and stirring empathy. And he said, like they're afraid to let us reach the public or teach workshops or do anything because of the harm we have caused. But we have done so much work on ourselves, and we believe we can help and mentor. So the idea of empathy really got to him. But of course, the only stories we had at that point to send him were stories of women in Long Island's jails. And what happened was utterly remarkable, that these men, reading the stories of women and girls in Long Island jails, they talked about the moments of reckoning and coming to terms with the harm they had caused, and possibly wanting to partner with organizations working with women who are serving life sentences without hope for parole. But like, sometimes the change is nothing we ever thought of. But the dream is, can that go viral? Imagine a world in which men who had, as part of their whole upbringing culture, done tremendous harm to women. Imagine them in prisons and jails all over the country, all over the world, reading these stories, but then using them to learn how to write their own stories to help people believe in empathy and second chances. And then the next day, we're hearing about second graders saying, if your words had the power, and one child saying, my words had the power, our family would have more than one mattress, because it's a little bit home for however many of us to sleep on one mattress. So it's that sense of the power, but also we can be, Helen always has a term for this that I repeat all the time and I love, of brave vulnerability. But but the other way of looking at it is too often you have this split between the, say, groups like, a lot of the self-help groups where, yes, you're a sinner, you did wrong, repent, repent. And then you have other groups that are saying, well, society is so horrible and it's unequal. So people who've had hard knocks, of course, it's not their fault. And I think what we are doing, which uses a sustained guided memoir, and what Helen was talking about, the listening in community, everybody in the circle says, no, you can go a little bit deeper. I love that part you wrote, but could you please slow down so we can really walk in your shoes? And you see, when we use that, then what happens is that people do reflect. They do take responsibility, but they can also trace the journey. And if this whole world is ever going to go beyond violence and revenge, you need all of our stories. And you need all of us to reflect and all of us to take responsibility, but also all of us to find the light inside ourselves, but also hear the light inside other people.
Yes. Oh, wow. That was so good. That was like a masterclass on how humanity can conduct themselves and get to a healing place. I love the way the example you used with that. And I told you guys before we started recording, and this ties into that. I firmly believe that anyone from local all the way to national level government, before they're ever allowed to take an oath and hold that office, they should sit down in a room and participate in a Herstory circle, telling their own stories, listening to other people's stories, because all of a sudden, that example you used with the 2 jails and what these men learned from reading the stories of the women who've been incarcerated, and that kind of accountability come to reality moment, that reckoning, that acknowledgement, but also the empathy. We can be accountable and empathetic at the same time. Those two do not have to be mutually exclusive. And I think that attaches itself to a character trait. So the next thing is the self-care piece of this. So much, I think this is, Herstory to me is self-care for society. It has such a healing power to it. When you get multiple groups, you talked about, Erica, earlier, the people that are in the workshops that come from all these different backgrounds. You might have, if you're sitting in a workshop, I'm going to use examples from when I was there in Hofstra on Long Island. You may have an upper middle class woman, very privileged, never really known a lot of economic or hardship from a safety and feeding herself daily standpoint. In the same room as a young man who has dropped out of school to help feed his family and got tied in with Herstory through a nonprofit organization in hopes that, and he's now working on his GED and working 2 jobs, but also wanting to tell his story to help people understand a policy that has impacted. The upper middle class woman is there because she's an active, engaged volunteer and she wants to do some good. She comes into this room not having any idea what she's getting into and leaving that room more changed than she ever imagined. And I use that example because that's the kind of nuance that happens with these things. And you all get to see it regularly. You talked about, Erica. Herstory is all over the place. It's on college campuses. It's in second graders' classrooms. It's in high school classrooms. It's in jails. It's in little conference rooms at community centers. It's on Zoom. It's in all these different spaces, allowing places for these. And I'm so glad you talked about the confidentiality piece, because this is a place for you to dip into your story, your page one moment, as you all call it, and think about those pieces that you are ready to share, but then it can also change a heart and a mind in terms of the way things always have been done, or this makes the most sense statistically. Okay, but what about the human impact? And I think it's just understanding that human impact. And also, so many times too, you can be in a story in a Herstory group and realize that, wait a minute, our value system, our values, the things we care about aren't all that different. We just have a different way of going about solving the problem. But now that I've heard your story, I can see more clearly that maybe my way didn't have all the information, was a little misguided. I mean, and that's the changing the hearts and minds piece of that. You laid that out so well. So going back to Helen, you nodded your head when I said, in so many ways, I see her story as self-care in healing society. What does that bring up for you?
You know what's so interesting is that I'm listening to Erica. I'm like, yeah, that's right. Yeah, that's true. Yeah, I agree with that. And I think one of the things that when you said that, society, what is society, right? We're a group of all different walks of life. And, from a funding perspective, as I had been in philanthropy for some time, we often think, oh, these programs, they're for Black folks or Hispanic folks or, gay folks. But the first time I met Erica, one of the things I said to her was, well, we got to make sure we get everybody in the room. And it's interesting that Erica said to me, that's never really been a problem for her story.
Yeah.
That her story has this natural radar beacon where people just, they just get to her story. And so in any one room, you will see this sort of microcosm of what the U.S. looks like. Mm-hmm. And not only the U.S., but the world, right? Because the U.S. is so fortunate to have people from all over the world here.
Yeah.
And you might think, oh, Long Island, it's, who's from Long Island? It's a small place or it's way out there. But, folk gravitate to her story from all over. So we have been, so blessed to have worked in Little Rock, Arkansas with the Winthrop Rockefeller Foundation, with, in Nicaragua, we've worked with folks there. I mean, it's just a thing that works everywhere.
Yeah.
And it's not about exclusion and it's not about DEI and inclusion. It's just for everyone. So, when you said self-care for society, I started to think, well, what does that actually mean? And then I started to think about empathy and compassion. So for me, empathy is, and for most people, you get to walk in somebody else's shoes. You hear their story and you feel the there-ness of that moment.
Yeah.
You might be a little girl, 12 years old, on a bus, leaving her grandmother from a small town in Honduras. And by the end of the story, you feel like you're sitting next to her on the bus. Mm-hmm. But compassion, so that's, empathy, I feel it. But compassion is the doing of it. Yeah. What do you do with that? So that compassion is like the call to action for you as a human being. Now that I've heard the story, I cannot ignore it. I cannot deny this is happening. I saw that little girl, even though the person writing the story is now 40 years old.
Mm-hmm.
I saw that little 12-year-old girl.
Yeah.
And so how dare you? How can we dare you to care? As is the name of the workbook that we use.
Yeah.
And the notion is that if you dare yourself to care,
Yeah.
what would your words say to us about your life and who you are and how you can make this world a better place? It is a time of great confusion. It is a time of great need for compassion.
Yeah.
Because even if things are going to happen in a certain way, that doesn't mean it has to happen the way maybe it's happening. Maybe it's a different way, a different roadmap for people.
Yeah. Yeah.
So that's kind of what I was thinking. And I also think that oftentimes we say at Herstory that it's not about judging a person. It's about judging their story structure.
Yeah.
If you understand, we're giving people a skill set around literacy, around listening, around you writing your best college essay, about you writing the best proposal for your nonprofit. So it has very literal ways to improve your life and your skill set.
Yeah. It teaches you how to invite people into a moment. So when you're trying to make an important point to help someone understand a situation and why it is you want to take these steps, you have that tool set to bring them into the moment with you that is invaluable. I can say that. I mean, and I'm glad you brought that up, because when you go to these workshops and you're writing, each of you are writing, you get a lot of feedback. And it took me a few weeks to get my page one moment to where it was really, people felt like they were in the moment with me. It took me peeling back all those things that I learned about grammar and spelling and all those different spaces of, no, we're not trying to get a grammatically correct, perfectly spelled story. We're trying to invite you into the room with us, with the language that was used, with the tone of voice that existed, what I could smell, what I could see. And when you're invited into someone's moment that way, and that story hits, it goes back to what you said earlier, Helen, about the little girl leaving Honduras and leaving her grandmother and traveling dangerously across the water to get to safety. You can't unsee that. Anytime something comes up about someone from that group, you hear that little girl and you hear that story, and it makes you think about the decision you make, whether it's voting, whether it's signing a document saying you support something, whether it is an organization you decide to donate to or not donate to, depending on how they're impacting this group. You can't unsee that. It changes everything. And I think that also helps us tap into the human side of us. And that is an important component of self-care right now, that we still feel like we can do something. We can make an impactful decision, make an impactful choice with our voice, with our dollars, with our, engagements. And I think that's a really important part of this. The next talking point is about confidently setting boundaries. You all have to decide who it is you're going to work with organizationally and who you're going to invite into being part of this program with you. And so talk to me about what guides, and there's some people that don't fit. If they don't, if they aren't willing to write with you, like that, you can't just like walk in to this space and not participate. Talk about why not just coming and sitting and listening. So like you learn right away. Like you don't, when you walk into it, you think, oh, I'm just going to go listen today. That's not an option. And that's a boundary that they have. Like, no, you have to participate. Erica, why is that so important that other people write, that you write and not just listen?
Well, I think the whole idea of the voyeur. We've had workshops in schools where the teacher escort will be making faces, or trying to. And I think that when one person is being vulnerable, again, I think the boundary is that nobody should be forced to confess or to go deeper than they want to. But that if everybody doesn't bring something, that then you're distinguishing, and we're not playing all those roles of stranger, reader and listener, but we have to always be in both roles. And I think I did want to return to, though, because I think they're related, the self-care question in terms of the care for the world and the way you put it, because especially in troubled times and tumultuous times, people often say, well, take care of yourself, take time off. Don't do this work. You need a break, you need a rest. Otherwise, you will not be able to care for everyone else. And I think one of these things, and it is a boundary thing, is a very wise board member said to me years ago, when I was diagnosed with a potentially very serious illness, which fortunately didn't manifest that seriously. And she said, don't ever let people say that herstory is killing. But you have to be very careful to do the work that nurtures and not do the work that drains. And I think that especially in these times, when there's so much uncertainty and sadness and danger and trauma, that connecting and feeling that we are working together, that I will deliberately choose after a long day of exhausting Zoom calls trying to raise money when the Herstory family, like all nonprofits, when money doesn't exist anymore, when people are making believe that we no longer need pandemic recovery funds, but as if the mental health, as if the trauma, as if the illness loss goes away after a year. But all of a sudden there will be a meeting about, as Helen said, a plan of action. This is so-and-so needs to hear this story. Or somebody tells a beautiful story. Another project I love, which does have to do with boundaries and healing, is that we have a project in Wyandanch where which we call social workers at the forefront. Change is coming. And we have social work students from Adelphi and from Stony Brook who are fellows. And they're looking at the individual healing. But they're also looking at the macro and at the sort of changing and really learning. First, they're learning deep listening in the classroom to really kind of be quiet and hear what the students have to say. Work with the school counselors. Hear what is it like being a school counselor when there isn't enough counseling? because there's not enough money in the district.
Yeah.
And how can they sort of what they hear about the beauty and the power and the strength of these teachers, these counselors, community members, how can they make an action? And so I think that, and every once in a while it comes up about self-care because, of course, everybody, but in being able to share the vulnerability, how do you all feel when a student dies or when a family is like so besieged that the child can't go to school because the parents are working 6 jobs and there are 6 children at home? And that kind of sense, and Helen and I were kind of joking about self-care on Saturday, and it was my birthday, and I said, well, I only took the calls that I knew would be inspire me and make me feel that there was a lot of hope and a lot of action. So, of course, I was talking to Helen, and it's like we were saying, well, there's a difference between self-care and selfishness. And caring for oneself is actually caring for one's connection to the world, and doing things for other people. And especially these last few weeks, I really only feel I'm caring for myself when I'm doing the work that's most beautiful, and good. And not when I'm just thinking of me. If I'm thinking of me, it's like drives me crazy,
Yeah, that's the beauty of her story right there. There is that empowerment piece. There is that piece of feel like that is a relief, that feels like I'm engaged, where you find community, where you find vulnerability, where you can have people from all these different spaces and places and backgrounds, but you all collectively there know that you have the power to make a difference with each of the stories and getting the stories out there. And that relieves stress and gives good hormones, fills up your serotonin. I mean, there is a lot of value in that. I love that the way you explained that, Erica, so much wisdom, which is not surprising. You're one of the wisest people I've ever met. So, and that really ties into taking care of our emotional, mental, physical health. This is a piece of that, how you approach that. You used such a good example on Saturday. It's my birthday. Today, I'm just taking calls that I know are going to edify my spirit and give me hope and lift me up, because there are days you walk out of a Herstory workshop and you've heard some stories that are really impactful. And I used to make a practice of, I would leave from there and I would go to the beach and walk along the ocean and just let everything I heard settle into my system and process it and allow it to kind of move through and just give. And that was a mode of self-care I would use on those days where I heard stories that were really important and needed to be heard, and also were like sometimes shocking to me because I just didn't know that kind of story existed. I didn't know that was happening, or it came to life in a different way, or I shared a part of my story that struck a chord with someone else in a really powerful, unexpected way. And that's just me sitting in there as one person participating in a room. You all are in multiple rooms, not just across Long Island where you're established, but across the world via Zoom and all this wonderful technology we have. So yeah, knowing that line of today is an edifying day so that I don't get drugged down and I have got space for my emotions to process and move through all of this information I'm taking in. Because especially as a facilitator, where you're really drawing these stories out of these people, these kids, and you're going into some really complex situations. I mean, just going into a jail and working with people that are imprisoned and hearing their stories, just walking into that space has an impact on you. And then, but also, I think through hearing these stories, you realize, oh, these are people too. And so you've got to have a place and a space to take care of yourself, to tend to your mental, emotional, physical health, so that you can continue to do the work. Are there other practices, Helen, I'll start with you, that you have, and then Eric, I'll go to you, that help you with that balance?
I'm reminded, Melissa, of your story. I had no experience with a person of your background. And I just was, what? What is happening? I don't understand. And then little by little, I'm like, oh, and I think what happens is that you not only say, these are people too, you say, this could have been me.
Yeah.
This could have happened to me had I grown up in this family, had I been a part of this community, had I not had the resources that I did, had I never learned English, had I, all of those had I,
Yeah.
equals up to. But I will tell you that I do have some things that I do, because you very intuitively understand that listening to other people's stories could feel like a burden, feel like story after story on top of because you could be like myself. We have a workshop called Testify, and Testify is Stony Brook students. Now, generally, we have 10 students in the workshop, and that's perfectly fine for me and Barbara Levin, who is doing it from California. And, we constantly say, we're so exhausted. This workshop is from 6:30 to 8:30 at night. But we wouldn't trade it for the world.
Yeah.
Because to see young people and their struggles from around the world, they've come to this university.
Yeah.
And some are American kids, and some are kids from Hong Kong and China and Pakistan and Haiti and Latin America. And anyway, they start telling their stories, and they're like helping us understand. I'm 65 years old. I'm understanding young people in a different way. They're not the same as we were.
Yeah.
They're not anything like we were.
Yeah.
Yes, they have big hearts and they're smart as heck, but what they have to deal with is very different than what we had to deal with.
Yeah.
And so this idea of helping them with coming up with an action for themselves, where do I fit into this world? And it's a place where you can be authentic. Where else can you be authentic? You have to be the good daughter or the good son. You have to be the good worker. You have to wear all of these masks. It's exhausting.
Yeah.
So we try to help them understand that while it feels like you're going through a lot as you're telling your story, you're also at the same time unburdening yourself.
Yeah.
By sharing the story. It's almost how you fall in love with somebody else, right?
Yeah.
They tell you about them and you hear their story and you tell their story. At the same time, I do tell them, and I do this myself, that I drink a lot of water. Mm-hmm. When I get off of the call, I drink a lot of water. I also try to make space for myself. Maybe it's a guided meditation that I'll do, something. Erica and I have been on really rough calls, with folks in Nicaragua, and the Zoom is not working, and they are under the threat of somebody jailing them for what they're talking to us about. And we get off the call, and I say to Erica, I need to go take a shower. I just need to take a shower. Mm-hmm. There's so much. But I'm grateful. That's the other part. What are you grateful for in terms of hearing these stories? The privilege. Understand it is a privilege.
Yeah, thank you for that. Erica, what about you? What are some mechanisms that help you?
I was just joking. Uh, we have someone new coming onto our staff who I think is the person I've always dreamed about, who could maybe take a lot of the weight of the part of the job I hate away
Yeah,
and really share the wonderful things too. So I was
yeah,
talking to her and mentioned this whole self-care thing. And when I do
yeah.
texts, I use my thumb and I think very fast, but I'm also always multitasking. And I always push the send button, and then it comes out with bizarre messages of, where I seem like this illiterate weirdo because all the autofit words are wrong. But so I was saying, like, well, I have to take a deep breath. And then we were saying, but I can't really take a deep breath. And it drives me crazy. People say it because I have a spinal curvature. My lungs won't go deep.
Yeah.
But that
Yeah.
aside, it's like, for me, I don't need to take a deep breath. I don't need to stop. I don't need what I need. And what, like, the closest facilitator relationships. Like, I can count on Helen after a long, exhausting day. So we're both exhausted beyond. And the phone rings. And Helen says, I got to tell you what happened. And these people are crying. And the lady's another one. It's like she's been in the court, and or all of a sudden the phone rings and I see it's Judge Camacho, and I was going to take a nap, and it's like I was so tired I didn't think I could move. So I think that, but more and more when you talked about boundaries and where not to go. The advantage of an organization being 30 years old is that in the beginning, you have to waste a lot of energy trying to have people figure out who you are, what you do, the why of it. We're finally reaching a point where people are, say, coming to us. Suddenly, well, we need a club. Well, and the guidance person says, well, do you have the money for it? And I say, of course not, but we need a club and we'll figure it out. And it's like for me, it's the being around the people who are sort of in the struggle with you, and just knowing that you could be sort of, that to me is the nurture. And it's not, there are certain people who say, oh, we're together and it's a family Thanksgiving and I don't want to hear about your work. I've learned to avoid those family Thanksgivings. My work, where people say, what do you do for fun? Well, this is what I do for fun. I love it.
Yeah.
And or people will say, like, so I'm 78 years old. Well, aren't you going to retire? No, I do want to. I don't ever want to stop, but I do want more and more to do what to me is going to be a gift or something I can leave to the world. So, yeah.
Yeah, and having those people to help you do those things you don't love so you can put energy into the things you do love, that in itself is really tending to your mental, emotional, physical health. It's removing those stressors and allowing you to put your time into the pieces that you really love about it, because it is a whole organization. It requires, all the fundraising and the administrative and the emails and the Zoom links. I mean, there's just so many little pieces to it to keep it going, the contacts. And so, just making space for you to be able to do that. But the work itself it oozes from you, your passion for it, and it continues to.
But the challenge, the challenge is, again, so it's not just the me thing, is how, and this is as an organization, we're sort of leaving our much delayed childhood to sort of be only this family, both functional and dysfunctional, into how do we do it? Because there is work nobody loves. Or you have to somehow find people who love the work. But how can we do this with compassion, with tenderness for each other? How can, when we are overwhelmed, when the world is asking, when the family is hungry, the world is hungry, how can we not just be thinking each of us of ourselves, but how can we protect everybody? And different people on the staff, a tiny staff, but they have different needs. And some do need curl up in a ball and don't want to talk about, And I think that's one of the things that Helen and I both lead organizations that we can learn from each other. How do you be, it's not really being the mother of us all, but especially when you know people's stories, you know more about them, and how do you forgive yourself when it gets too hard and there's not enough?
That's a really great way to put that larger tending, and being aware of that, and also just different people's bandwidth. That's so, thank you for that. That was really, really good. All right. And this really spoke to, everyone's story is welcome. Herstory is unapologetic about the fact that come in and tell your story. We want to hear you. You're not like someone walks in a room. It doesn't matter their socioeconomic background, whether they have a high school diploma or not, whether they're 80, whether they're 15. I mean, it's very unapologetic in its approach to, no, everyone's story needs to have a place to be heard and seen, and and valued and honored in the way this person feels safe telling it. I think that's one of the beautiful things, and I just wanted to point that out in just that way that people are also, you said it really well earlier. Well, the putting together of the story has feedback and judgment, but the story itself never does. Never does. You're able to do that. How do you do what happens when you hear a story that is very different than your own way of knowing the world to be, or your experience, or what even you think is right or wrong, and approaching that of like, oh, okay, I see how they got here. I still don't agree with them, but I see how they got here. Talk to me about managing that kind of unexpected story in a room that you don't know how it's going to impact people. Does that make sense?
Yeah, Sue. I think the best example is still in the what to do about judgment-provoking moments in the manual we all use. And that had a big impact, again, on the guys from prison. But there's also another group we work with, Time Out of Joint, and where we have the National Behind Bars, Beyond Bars Fellows. And one of them had wrote this extraordinary piece of being a young man and the, killing the man or the young, really, they were both kids who had raped his sister. And it's the most extraordinary, and it's called A Time to Kill. And it's very, very strong. And when he first read it on the Zoom screen, I'm looking and there are women, there are, different people. There was a young girl whose father died in prison. And nobody, not only didn't they know what to say, they were watching me. What would I say? And, as someone comes out, I usually just say, wow. But the main thing is that in this case, he really let me walk in his shoes and understand. I almost could have done something that was unthinkable.
Yeah.
So I talked that and I talked, but it began to lead into, and this is a man who is just out to help the world in every way he can now that he's out of prison, but then it's like, rather than immediately going, oh, well, if people weren't allowed to have guns or whatever, we really, but we were talked about the whole revenge thing. But then later, when we came back, because he read it several times and then read it in Harlem, he started saying we need to have something which he called conversations that dare you. And they need to be viral, where he would read a piece like that. Groups in prisons, groups of allies, groups of judges, of lawyers, of criminology students. And then he pointed out something very interesting, because the end of the piece said, so I was sentenced to 16 years. Am I wrong? And then he said, you know what? I wanted you to judge. I'm asking the audience, the stranger reader, to judge. So that's the other thing that we're doing. Instead of saying, which seemed good on the surface, we had a young woman, like way back, 2006 or so, we have a recording from the jail. And she said, if I let you into my story, will you promise not to judge? It is, please do not have sympathy for me, because my sympathy, your sympathy, I do not need. It is neither good or bad. It is my story. Sounds beautiful. Is it a promise any of us can keep? Of course not. The stranger reader is the worst judge in the world, because they don't have to be accountable to anybody. You're curled up in bed with a book. You can think. So what we realized is we're teaching people to go to a level of shared humanity, deeper and beyond judgment. But we're making the onus on the writer to not to utter the world, don't judge me, because that's not true. Judges are going to judge people, but what sort of a story can you write for the worst judge you could ever imagine, or the worst legislator? And so, and when Shiraz kept saying, but I'm asking to be judged, I mean, this is where, in a way, saying, like, judge me, help me grow. And the same man has been on programs with us at Touro Law Center at different law schools. And he said, he always says, I'm not a grown man, I'm a growing man. And it's like, never did I dream when we started this all women's organization and that And by 2010, when we started working in schools, we'd be working with boys and men and people of all genders, including transgender people, and, but that, we would be actually working men and women together in this, and still be deeply feminist. And it was the men on our board when we changed from Herstory Writers Workshop to Herstory Writers Network. And some of the women suggested maybe we don't call it Herstory anymore. And the four men at that point started to cry. And they said, no, we have to rewrite history. And so we've kept Herstory, but you get all these boys on their compositions and like writing Herstory.
I love that example that you use there of how you manage that situation and what was drawn out, and your ability to know through years of experience and just your own wisdom of how to respond in those moments, in those situations. That's so powerful. And I want to bring attention to one of the favorite things that has been done over the last several years is having these law students and law enforcement in the same room with these people who have been incarcerated, because the level of understanding, what it makes you think about as you go into that profession, as you're interacting with, there's so many stigmas and stereotypes that we have about groups and populations of people. And when you put them in a room together and share the story and put a human behind that condition, that situation, it can't help but impact you. And I love that so much. It's one of my so many favorite things to do. But the other pieces is being in the schools and giving these kids voices that have never had voices before. One of the most powerful things I got to do is my last spring I was there. Unfortunately, we moved right after that, but I was part of a group that was able to work with a group of middle school kids and helping these middle school kids tell their stories where no one's ever asked them before what it is that they believe, think, have an opinion about. They had been stereotyped and stigmatized in their different schools as being sassy and difficult and all these things. And when they just were looking for a place to be seen and heard and not judged based on a stereotype, this is what Herstory does. And this is what it does unapologetically and so beautifully and navigates. And this is why this facilitator training is so important. So you can handle moments like Erica just talked about, of hearing that unexpectedly powerful story that maybe took a turn in a room full of people that you don't know how they're going to be impacted by it, and knowing how to respond in that moment where everyone still feels safe and everyone still feels the freedom to feel what it is they need to feel, process what they need to process, say what they need to say. That is nuanced. It is complex and necessary. I mean, it's all of those things wrapped in one. And that really goes into, and I think this is going to be very interesting, living out of your own expectations versus others. Time and time again over the years, you all have had to, I don't want to say defend, but people will come at you like, why memoir writing? Why not creative writing? Why not this line? And Erica, you've had to again and again and again. It's like, nope, this is the pathway. This is the route we're going to go. But you did that on your own with a lot of people questioning that approach. I'm going to give this to Helen first. What was your first thought when you met Erica and heard that memoir writing was the avenue?
Well, for me, it was a great joy because I came in as a writer first.
Yeah.
I did not come in as a facilitator. And if you knew the hours of training it requires to even, it's very competitive.
Yeah.
There are a lot of people who want to be facilitators, not just anybody. And so between the board and Erica and other, the senior facilitators, those folks are specially selected to be a part of this because of the awesome responsibility we have.
Mm-hmm.
You know, you could hear a story and it's very deep, as, you know, some stories I've told Erica around sports and girls in sports, especially on the college level, tennis and ice skating, and to hear how these systems just have so much power. And, you know, the word empowered has been used and overused so many times. But, you know, in this case, it's almost like you're not just empowering the person, you're trying to pull down a system that is hurting people.
Yeah.
Because no one stood up for them.
Yeah.
If I look around my office here, I'm looking at Herstory stories that we framed as part of an arts exhibit for the local library here in Long Beach, New York, because every Hispanic Heritage Month, they call, well, we want you to come and do this and do that. No. Here are some amazing stories, and we're going to put them up as if they're pieces of art.
Yeah.
But it's the written word. And so, you know, the greatest pleasure for me is when both Erica and I are listening to a story and both of us look all of a sudden like, oh, like we caught a fragment of where the story should go. It's sort of like putting this little puzzle together. And that for me is like when Erica says, well, and she asks this probing question maybe, and I'm like, yeah, I got that one too. And these systems that hurt, literally hurt, like the immigration system and everything that's happening right now, DEI, it's those things was to try to right a wrong.
Yeah.
Those things were not to give people a leg up above somebody else.
Yeah.
They're to right something that was never equal.
No.
And so when you hear a story about a man from Mexico who, you know, was in the army and in Mexico and crossed the desert with his best friend when he was 19 years old, and the coyote said to them, the person who was taking them, you know, through the desert, you know, said to them, you know, you've got to leave that woman behind. Just because she fell and she's hurt, you don't carry her, you leave her. And he points up to a mountaintop and says, you see what's there? Those are real coyotes. And they're going to bring the whole group down. And these two young kids carried that woman all the way.
Oh my gosh.
To at the end of the story, hear him say that many, many years later, he runs into this woman in Jackson Heights, Queens, in a Spanish deli, and she introduces him to her son, and his son's name is Jesus, just like his. She named her son after him because he saved her life.
God. Oh my God. And that right there, that's the power of memoir. That's why memoir versus other forms of writing. That right there. And I just tell you, you just have to experience it to understand it.
Let's make sure we say guided memoir, because memoir is gone.
Yeah.
The write your story, like when teachers say journal, everybody journal.
Yeah.
And then they collect it. And it's so full of unprocessed trauma that the teachers don't know, or the mandated reporters. So the idea again of guiding so that you transform it into a powerful work of art that will show the human spirit, that will not re-traumatize you, that will not scare your readers into sending you to some therapist and not looking you in the eye. you know?
Yeah.
The
Yeah.
idea of guiding people so that they do have, one woman called it the arms of herstory coming around her. But
Mm.
it doesn't happen just like, say, if you say, okay, we're all going to use memoir without the pedagogy that really
Yeah.
focuses on how every scene, every paragraph, how do you not leave the leader behind? How do you make sure that people's eyes don't glaze over when you start telling your life academically instead of
Yeah.
from your heart? We have a whole new 9 new Turo Law Center interns and public pro bono work, and they're working with the Court of All Youth. But they're used to writing
Mm.
legal papers. And when they
Yeah.
first started, it's like they were just, and very important themes. And they were handpicked. So their motivation for doing the work and looking, and some are being prosecutors.
Wow.
Judge Camacho had to convince me that prosecutors can really play an important role, and it's important
Yeah.
for future prosecutors to do this. But we had to really undo all the legal writing. Just take me there. Take me there.
Yeah. Get all the technicality. But I'm glad you brought up guided, because I want to be very clear. There is a very structured system that Herstory has in play. You get guidebooks to walk through and work through to really help you learn how to do this in a way that is effective and powerful and guided, and getting to that page one moment where literally the values and why of Herstory are changing hearts and minds. And it's feeling like you're in the room. But yeah, I bet with those people that are used to writing legal briefs and all of that very formal writing, you got to deconstruct that. I'm like, I don't care how it's spelled. I don't care if it's a complete sentence. I want to be in that space with you and what you were thinking, what you were feeling, what kind of, what was moving through your body and your mind, what you were smelling, all those kinds of things. It's a very different thing, but they will be better prosecutors for it via being better humans for it. They will be able to see those people as people and not just a stereotype taken off the street that needs to be put away, which then turns into changing the way our jail systems work, where they're actually about rehabilitation and not just locking people up. And that's a whole other episode. But that's the power that this changing hearts and minds has, which is a core value and why. And we're wrapping this up here. There's so many layers to Herstory and the people's stories that are engaged in it, and being able to really process and move through all that the way you all do over the years and being involved with this. Talk to me about the impact this has had on each of you as people, and we'll try to do it quickly because we're running a little over on time, but I think it's important. Talk to me about the impact this has had on you and the relationships you have made through this work. Helen, go ahead and go first.
I'll do it quickly. I mean, it's life changing, and I had come off of a rather difficult period, and I came to Herstory at that moment, having lost a job, lost kind of everything. Thankfully, my family was intact and all of that, but I had lost my way. I had just lost my way, and walking into Herstory really helped me gain that confidence that I had lost, and that direction and the purpose. Oftentimes people will say, you're so passionate, Helen, but then, even with that passion, that's not enough,
Yeah.
To make something work well. And so I often have conversations with the power above saying, you made me this way. You better show me the way to make it happen. And her story is part of that story for me.
Oh, thank you for that. And Erica, what about you?
I think it has coming out of just a very, very thorny childhood with a mother who had wonderful justice values and was an activist, psychologist, and everything, but really never very much the unhealed healer. And also in the days before domestic violence was even a word, so that what happened to her, on the one hand, being a healer, but hanging on to this victim thing. It's like, as one of our teachers say, we have gone from being victims, like she sees the young people every semester move from being victims to victors. And I think it has gradually, the part of me that wanted both to be seen, acknowledged, like as somebody who was good enough and not a victim of other people's hunger and domestic violence and, just cruelty really passed on. And it's kind of helped me see a new way of making family, of understanding everything we've been talking about, understanding boundaries, not romanticizing, that we can sort of, in a way, we cannot redo our past. And memoir is about the past. But the past, in a way, cannot be rewritten. But the truth can, as it gets, what you were saying, more and more layers, it's like that truth sort of sets us free. And we each end up with all the baggage and all the losses. And it may never, depending who we were, it may never be the perfect family we dreamed, the perfect sense of happiness we dreamed. We may always be, I think one thing that unites all of us is we do all come from struggles, emotional struggles, many of us physical struggles, and many of us societal struggles. But the thing is that in the end, this journey is not about accepting or forgiving, but it's about using whatever hand we were given. And I do find it, adult children, now grandchildren, I do find that this journey has helped me in every aspect of my life. And I can't grow one part without having to grow the other. And that takes it to sort of self-care and building our world and knowing that, we're doing the best we can. But as they said at this NAACP gathering a weekend ago, it's like we have to remember where we came from, but we have to remember the work is going to get harder and harder. And being older is no excuse. So that's what I
That was so good. Both of you. Thank you so much for that. All right. We are down to the end here. And I hope all of you have gotten a taste today of what this important, vital organization does. And like any nonprofit, the more resources it has, the more people it can reach. And I can't imagine a more important tool right now that this world needs than this organization. And I just feel so strongly about that. And so this is your opportunity, folks, to go to herstorywriters.org and click the donate button on the main page. And that is going to be your opportunity to support this beautiful, necessary, brave, authentic, courageous organization. And that is just, I will say that and scream it from the mountaintops, because I have seen in my own person the power of it. I've seen it. I've experienced it. These two women have dedicated their lives to it, and there's others with them that do this important work every day. So if you want to see her story in your neighborhood, donate, because they need more resources to get to your neighborhood. But go look at their website. Look if there's ways that you can connect with them, because again, they're able, thank you to technology, to be available worldwide now. So take a look, email them, ask questions if you are intrigued by this. But first and foremost, we've got to give to them so that they have the resources to go to all the places that this needs to be happening and heard. That wraps up this special episode as part of Podcasthon. If you want to hear other stories and podcasts that are part of this tremendous, incredible, I can't even use all my words right now. I'm so passionate about this. Go to podcasthon.org and learn about all of the different podcasts and organizations that are out there. But I really hope and pray and implore you to go see how you can support her story. You really won't be the same. And Erica and Helen, thank you so much for your time today. Thank you for how you show up in the world. Erica, thank you for this organization. We need it so badly. And thank you for your persistence in continuing this work.
Thank you.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Helen, thank you as always. Good to see you, my friend.
Same here, my girl. Keep on keeping on.
We will. So you friends, you can also go to embracinglayers.com, go to the resources page. All the information that I shared will also be there. So if you are driving down the road and you're like, I can't remember that great organization's name, that's okay. Go to embracinglayers.com, follow us on socials. You'll be able to find it. But remember this organization when you're thinking about where you need to donate. If you're worried or concerned, where can I make a difference? How can I do something right now? This is how you can do it. Take good care and have a great